one of the most sophisticated nervous systems among invertebrates.
They look like the aliens of the sea. It's no secret that octopuses are very intelligent.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast known as On My Nerves. The show is all about science and pop culture. I'm your host, Olivia Pelson, and I'm a student who has far too many questions about the world, so she had to create a podcast in order to research them and talk about them with people, because no one else wants to talk about them with me. Anyways, moving on. Recently, I've been spending a lot of time reading and researching animals, which is not very typical of my degree since I study neuroscience. The closest I usually get to learning about other animals' behavior and nervous systems is usually when I get to study mice, zebrafish or zebrafish, and fruit fly models. But every so often in my degree, I actually get to touch grass and learn a little zoology. And this past semester was one of those times. I used to love all of the animal documentaries on National Geographic and on Netflix growing up. I also loved the PBS show Wildcrats up until I was like 13, 14. Like I was in middle school still watching these because I had younger siblings, so they would watch them and I would sometimes watch them with them. And I love talking about animals in addition to the brain and other things. So it was inevitable that I would eventually bring up some organism on this podcast and make it an entire episode. Will this be every episode moving forward? No, but I will probably do it every so often because it's really fun. And I know the title of this episode may sound like an episode of Animal Planet, but octopi, or octopuses, as we will discuss later, are genuinely some of the most fascinating animals found on the planet. And it just so happens that they are perfect when it comes to discussing breakthroughs in neuroscience research. A little fun fact about me is that I used to volunteer at the National Aquarium in Baltimore, Maryland, in the US. In fact, I actually started volunteering there when I was a freshman in high school and stayed there pretty much up until the pandemic hit when I was a junior. And like a lot of middle school and high schoolers, I really wanted to be a marine biologist. I just thought it was one of the coolest jobs out there, and I loved the idea of doing field research. I know now there's way more that goes with that job, but that's the part I thought was coolest. Anyways, when I worked at the aquarium, there were a couple of animals that I absolutely loved to talk about and would just go on and on about them. The octopus was one of them. Some other animals were also crocodiles. Yes, this aquarium did have small freshwater crocodiles, jellyfish, and sand tiger sharks. Honestly, any of these animals could have also been an entire episode, but the octopus is personally one of my favorites. And as I briefly mentioned before, cephalopods are very important in early neuroscience research. So usually I despise breaking down and defining terms to start off any kind of presentation or talk or podcast, but for the sake of referring to the correct plural form of octopus, I'm going to real quick. Because I think sometimes people get a little bit confused over which plural form is the most correct to use or should be used. And please bear with me for a minute because I am not a linguistics major, nor was I ever the star English student through high school. Like, I did fine, but I always preferred science and math. I mean, I did well enough to get good grades, but it was never my favorite class. Anyways, octopus comes from the Greek octopus, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. And it was spelt, in modern English letters, O-K-T-O with a K, meaning 8, and P-O-U-S, meaning foot. So, animal with 8 feet, or in this case, arms. Pus and pod are the Greek roots meaning foot or feet, but the modernized Latin spelling of it is octopus, as we would spell it in American English today. I should also note that I never took Greek or Latin in high school, so most of what I'm learning here is off of Google and my very minimal knowledge of roots that I learned in science class. The plural form of octopus is probably one of the most debated, put that in air quotes, plural forms of a word because of how many people use the wrong versions of it. By far the most popular way to pronounce and spell multiple octopus is octopi. And when I say the most popular, I mean just like across the population. Like if you just went on the street and said, what's the plural form of octopus? A lot of people would probably say octopi. but pi is a Latin plural ending, and although today we use a modernized Latin spelling, the origin of the word is still Greek. So the correct Greek ending should be pods or pods. I've never really figured out which is the more correct pronunciation of that. So in my time working at the aquarium, I heard, the operative word there being heard, that there are 3 grammatically correct versions of octopus, including octopi, octopuses, and octopods, or octopodes. Again, I've never really figured out which is correct. When I started volunteering there when I was 15, I had never really heard octopods before, only octopi and octopuses, and I much preferred that way of referring to them. So for a long time, I used to say octopods because I thought it sounded the coolest out of all of them. But honestly, I feel like it's a Neanderthal situation, and you could probably say any of the 3, and it's generally acceptable in an informal context. Meaning, if you were just to walk out on the street and have a conversation with someone, you could say any of the 3, and they probably wouldn't bat an eyelash. However, when you're talking to scientists like to be very, very specific. So you should probably use the quote-unquote more correct version, the more grammatically correct version when talking in a more formal context. So that being said, I believe that octopuses is the most correct English spelling of the plural octopus. In literature, and when I say this, I mean in published research, I've seen researchers and institutions write octopuses most often. I've almost never seen octopi or octopods, even though I've heard people say those. And seeing it written out makes much more sense, like when you read it, but I hate saying it because it sounds very clunky. Like, it's like saying mooses or sheeps. Like, the plural of moose is just moose, and the plural of sheep is just sheep. So by that logic, why can't octopus just be its own plural? But it can't be. So we gotta add an ES on the end of that. And I would love to say I'm gonna keep it short and simple and only stick to the correct version. However, I may every once in a while slip in an octopi or an octopods by accident, and I apologize in advance. But I do mean octopuses, even though it is a stupidly long plural tense of the word. Moving on. So it is well known that octopuses are cephalopods, and cephalopods are a taxonomic class under the phylum Mollusca. In other words, cephalopods are mollusks, as are bivalves and snails. According to genetic research and the fossil record, they emerged during the explosion of animal diversity known as the Cambrian period. Cephalopod literally means head, foot, which is exactly the body structure of all cephalopods. Other than the octopus, the cephalopod class also consists of squid, cuttlefish, and the nautilus. Cephalopods are also invertebrate soft-body organisms. The nautilus is a soft-body organism, but lives inside a strong exterior shell. I know the cuttlefish also has some less squishy parts to it, but we're not really going to be talking about those today, so we're going to ignore that for now. The only solid part of the octopus and squid is actually their beak, which is located in the center of their ventral side. And because that's the only solid part of them, this means that they can fit through any hole that is larger than their beak. So they can squeeze through spaces that are exponentially smaller than their bodies. Although it may seem like, since they're invertebrates and look absolutely nothing like any vertebrate species, cephalopods do actually have something in common with most vertebrates. And that thing would be their eyes. Cephalopod eyes have a camera lens or non-compound eye structure that projects onto a retina, similar to that of a human's. The octopus specifically is a highly visual creature, especially when it comes to navigation and learning. They have lateralized vision that can use a single eye for perceptual and learning tasks. And biologists are fairly convinced that this similarity in cephalopod eyes and our eyes is due to the PAX6 gene, which has been traced back to our last common ancestor more than 500 million years ago. In the past, cephalopods have been very important in neuroscience research. Anyone who has ever taken a physics class understands that conduction of electricity requires a few factors in order to make the current transmit faster or slower. Our nervous system runs on both chemical and electrical signals. The chemical signals in our body include the release of neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, chemokines, and on and on. These are generated through the movement of ions over the membrane of nerve cells, or neurons. In other words, there is a rapid change in membrane potential, i.e. the ratio of ions on each side of the membrane, which results in a depolarization of the cell, meaning it becomes very negative, and resulting in a signal propagated down the axon of the nerve cell. The process of transducing an action potential down a cell must be fast in most organisms in order to be efficient. A few things can speed up this process, such as adding an insulator around the axon. This is the go-to standard for most organisms, and that insulator is myelin. The process of transducing a signal down an axon covered in myelin is known as saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction is the propagation of action potentials between nodes of Ranvier. And I definitely just pronounced that wrong, but it's French, so I'm sorry. This is unfortunate because I took 4 years of biology and French in high school, so I should definitely know how to pronounce this by now. And these nodes, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce that guy's name again, it's the space between myelinating cells, known as Schwann cells. So basically, if you limit the space between where cells that are insulating the axon start and end, you can also speed up conduction this way. And another way to speed up conduction is to increase the diameter of the axon, because this limits leakage of ions when transmitting an electrical signal. And having a thicker diameter of nerve axons is also the way in which neurons in squid can quickly transmit electrical signals. The giant axon in the squid is a part of one of the largest nerve cells ever found. The giant axon of a squid is about 1 meter long and is 1 millimeter thick. That doesn't sound very big, but that is visible to the naked eye, which when talking about cells is ginormous. And to be clear, I did not say it is the longest, I said it's one of the longest, because very large mammals also have very long recurrent laryngeal nerve axons, and some of these animals would include giraffes and whales. So nerves in some of these organisms can be over 5 meters long. That being said, squid definitely have one of the thickest nerves. In fact, originally, the giant axon in squid was not even identified as a nerve. It was originally thought to be some sort of muscle or tendon. And the giant axon is actually part of the squid's propulsion system, and runs from the ganglion to muscles carrying signals which control and coordinate movement. And the giant axon of squid eventually led to the development of very important techniques that are still used today in neuroscience research. Back in the 1930s, some important work headed up by Drs. Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley was being done to understand nerve cell excitability, a concept that a lot of scientists now take for granted today. The pair were able to insert an electrode into the giant axon of squid nerve fibers and record the potential difference of ions across the membrane. This was the first ever intracellular action potential recording, and they were able to do this using 2 electrodes. This dual electrode approach solved the issue of electrode polarization, and series resistance compensation proved to be a considerable advancement over the single electrode technique being used by Drs. Kenneth Cole and George Marmot. This technique is known today as voltage clamping. Voltage clamping allowed them to record ionic currents flowing across the axonal membrane, and their work gave rise to analyzing ion channel kinetics. Roughly 30 years later, a new and improved technique was developed by Drs. Erwin Neer and Bert Sackman, but they based their new approach on Hodgkin and Huxley's work, and their technique is now known as patch clamping. This is the technique that's actually more commonly used today, just because it's a little bit more precise and is actually able to record single ion channels from even the smallest of cells. However, both groups received separate Nobel Prizes for their work. Hodgkin and Huxley were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1963, and Drs. Neer and Sackman were awarded it in 1991, again for their work in electrophysiology. And investigating the properties of ion channels has led to numerous developments in medical and drug research. Their experiments not only taught us more about the nervous system, but pioneered techniques that are still used in cell biology and neuroscience today.
As I mentioned earlier, my favorite cephalopod, and definitely one of my favorite animals of all time, is the octopus. And there are over 300 species of octopus, some of which are still being discovered, because the ocean is a very big place and we have not discovered all of it. And the size of these different species can range anywhere from half an inch to up to 30 feet wide. And they can also weigh up to 600 pounds.
The typical meal plan of an octopus consists of crabs, shrimp, and other mollusks. And yes, you did just hear me say mollusks, which means that this also extends to other octopuses.
It's not uncommon for females to eat males after mating, or for hatchlings to eat each other. I will discuss this a little bit further into the episode, but to my knowledge, other octopuses are not their primary food source.
Octopuses are hunters. They are also pursuit predators, which means they move around and look for and chase prey. They do not ambush prey. Examples of ambush predators include moray eels and most big cats.
Many pursuit predators, including the octopus, are generally regarded as solitary animals, which means they prefer to live alone, and they usually live alone in dens that they build themselves. However, some species of octopus will congregate to form what scientists like to call underwater cities, which basically means that a lot of octopuses will den in the same general area. So to us, it looks like a little town. However, that's not actually what it is. And two of these researchers have actually nicknamed Octolantis and Octopolis. And I love Octopolis. I think it sounds so perfect and adorable for this concept. So I am absolutely for this. That being said, I think a lot of the underwater cities that have been discovered have actually been in or off the coast of Australia.
This denning behavior has also provided evidence that octopi have the capacity to form spatial memories. The reason behind this is that because they can create little homes for themselves, it shows that they can identify familiar objects and locations and navigate back to them using local mental maps. And I will definitely go into spatial memory more in a later episode because this is a topic I think is pretty cool, both in humans and all other animals.
One of the most unique features of the octopus is definitely everything in their anatomy, especially since they look like the aliens of the sea. The octopus has 8 arms. That's correct, arms, not tentacles. This sounds very elementary for those who study zoology or marine science, but the octopus is the only cephalopod that doesn't have any tentacles. Sadly, Google has let us all down this time because when you Google tentacle, the arm of an octopus will also show up in addition to other forms of tentacles, such as those on jellyfish and those on cuttlefish. Squid and cuttlefish both have 8 arms and 2 tentacles. The main anatomical difference between arms and tentacles in cephalopods is the arms are covered in suckers, while tentacles usually only have them at the ends. Usually tentacles also tend to have appendages that can hook onto prey at the end of them. So basically they have features that stick out in order to hook onto things. And arms and tentacles both have strong suckers that function a lot like suction cups. The use of these suckers can vary between squid and octopuses, but the mechanism by which they work is pretty similar. Octopuses use them to move around, interact with their environment and prey, and pick things up and manipulate objects. Like all cephalopods, their squishy heads are directly connected to their limbs because cephalopod means head, foot. And most of their organs are also located in the central part of their body, such as their stomachs, their brains, and their hearts. And yes, that is in fact hearts plural. A commonly shared fun fact about the octopus is that they have 3 hearts. One of their hearts, or the systematic heart, pumps blood around the body, while the other 2 pump blood around the gills in order to pick up oxygen. Most species of octopus and squid are also able to propel themselves through water to get away from predators or anything that's stressing them out. And they are able to do this by forcefully pushing water through a muscular tube called a siphon. And that's not even where their unique adaptations stop. Octopuses are known to be expert camouflagers. Hiders? No. They're great experts in disguise. Or whatever. They can blend into their surroundings easily. Almost all cephalopods have chromatophores, which are essentially elastic pigment-filled sacs that are connected to and controlled by their muscles and nerves. So when the muscles contract, these sacs expand, revealing vibrant pigments, usually reds, browns, and yellows. And when the muscles relax, they shrink back down, hiding the pigment. So this allows them to alter their color from like a grayish, bluish color to like a more vibrant color. Obviously, specific pigments can vary between species, but that's more or less how it works. And each chromatophore can code for one color. And like I said, different cephalopods can express different colors. In fact, the giant cuttlefish are also some of the most colorful of the cephalopods. Most cephalopods also have iridophores and leucophores. These cells can add more depth, basically, to the color of the animal's skin. The iridophores lie directly beneath the chromatophores and are responsible for displaying more metallic greens, blues, golds, and silvers. Leucophores are also known as the white spots. They can scatter and reflect all light from the environment and are assumed to be aiding in camouflage. Papillae on the surface of most cephalopod skin also allow them to change the appearance of the texture of their skin. So it allows like this texture of their skin to look a little bit more like the object they're trying to blend it in with. Given all these special skills, it should come as no surprise that the octopus is capable of excellent mimicry.
Ematopose coloration is also something that the octopus is capable of. Basically, there are photophores at the bottom side of both squid and octopus, and this suggests that they are able to do something called counter-illumination. I've always heard this technique is called counter-shadowing, but it's the same thing, I think. It basically means that there's bright light protecting the squid from anything beneath them, so primarily predators. For example, rays and skates will usually have usually their bottom side or their ventral side is usually like a sandy white color, and their top side or their dorsal side is usually like a much darker color. It could be like a black or maybe like a brownish rocky color to blend in with the darker ocean beneath them. And a lot of birds also exhibit this trait as well. Another famous characteristic of the octopus is their ability to ink in order to get away from predators or when they're stressed out. As a last resort defense tactic, cephalopods, in stressful situations, can release the contents of their ink sac. Almost all cephalopods have an ink sac. This is a bladder that can suddenly release a plume of defense, or something that essentially looks like black ink. Octopus and squid ink is a mixture of melanin-based chemical in the ink gland that makes the ink very dark, also mucus from the funnel organ, and tyrosinase, which is an irritant that can mess with the sense of smell, taste, and even sight of their predators. Ink can also be used as a distraction, or smokescreen, to get away from would-be predators and threats.
Not only can octopuses change the texture and color of their skin, but some species can also bioluminesce. A chemical reaction in these photophores results in light energy. A catalyst called luciferase sets off the light-producing substance called luciferin, and this results in an eerie glow. And this ability is quite similar to that of a firefly's. And a bunch of other deep-sea dwelling animals also are bioluminescent.
In my opinion, probably one of the weirdest, but also most interesting facts about the octopus have to do with their mating and reproduction, which of course it does, because so many animals in the animal kingdom have the weirdest mating rituals / ways of procreating. But the octopus is especially interesting because, as I said earlier, this animal has heads and arms. Cephalopod literally means head foot. So, what do you do with that? Most species of octopus only end up reproducing once in their lifetime. And as I mentioned earlier, some females are also sexual cannibals, which means that they will eat the males that they mate with, which sucks for them.
A weird fun fact about the male octopus is that one of its arms is actually modified to contain sperm packets, and the specialized arm is known as a hectocotylus. It's lined with spermatophores, which can break off, which means that part of its arm can actually break off, and a female can hold on to it until she's ready to fertilize her eggs.
So basically, this arm is different from the other 7 because A, it has sperm packets at the end of it, B, it has less suckers at the end of it because of those spermatophores, and C, because it can actually break off.
When this modified arm on males was discovered, scientists originally thought it was a new species of parasitic worms. because of where it was found on the female and also what it looked like. Females typically wait with their eggs until they hatch, and unfortunately, they usually die during this process.
Believe you can't easily tell females from males just by looking at them in the wild and observing them. You would have to actually observe certain behaviors from them to be able to tell, or get really up and close and personal, but that's generally not a good idea, primarily because it's distressful for the animals.
Now that I've talked about some interesting anatomical features and useful adaptations that the octopus possesses, I'm going to be talking about, in my opinion, their most impressive asset, and that would be their nervous system and their intelligence. Octopuses have a centralized brain and an independent neural system, controlling each of their arms. An octopus has about 500 million neurons in its body, 2/3 of which are distributed amongst its limbs. This means there are roughly 40 million neurons in each arm. Some publications have called this a 9-brain system, a central brain and one brain for each independent arm, while others have called it a 2-brain system, a central system and a peripheral system in all of its arms. Each arm of an octopus is able to control itself semi-independently from the central brain. The octopus does have a central brain located between its eyes containing over 180 million neurons. And this is the part of the nervous system that determines what the octopus wants and or needs. One reason that each arm is sometimes considered its own independent brain is not only because it can move and act independently, but because when an arm is severed, meaning it's no longer attached to the octopus, they sometimes still exhibit movement and functions as though they were intact.
An example of this would be food. So if the octopus requires nutrients, the brain would send out a signal saying, look for food,
and the arms would essentially move around somewhat independently using that signal to find food. Commands such as search for food are then received by each of the arms, who all have their own smaller independent brains. With these signals in mind, each arm is then able to gather its own sensory and positional data, process it, and issue its own commands on how to move by contracting or relaxing different parts of the arm, all without consulting its central brain. As each arm moves around, it keeps collecting and processing sensory information, and any relevant information, such as the location of food, then gets sent back to the central brain to make a larger decision. This is one of the largest and most sophisticated nervous systems among invertebrates. All 8 arms are interconnected at the axial nerve cord, and this connecting point is known as the brachial plexus.
The intramuscular nerve cords also play an important role in the motor control of each of the arms. They receive proprioceptive information from proprioceptors in their arms, which are embedded outside their suckers. On the underside of each arm, there are a number of highly sensitive suckers that are arranged in pairs. Suckers are a very important source of tactile, chemical, and spatial information. They are used in a variety of octopus behaviors, such as object manipulation, handling prey, and locomotion, or movement basically. Each sucker on an octopus is also innervated by its own sucker ganglion,
which does not communicate directly with other sucker ganglia. Instead, information from one sucker is channeled via the axial nerve cord to nearby ones. So this is essentially how each arm is able to communicate with itself.
And because of this, the octopus is one of the only invertebrates that is actually protected from animal research. So for anyone who isn't aware of most Western countries' government guidelines on animal research, pretty much all vertebrates and mammals are protected, but invertebrates usually are not. But the octopus and squid are one of the few exceptions. So, for example, an invertebrate that is not considered a protected animal by most governments would be like flies. So fruit fly research is pretty common in neuroscience.
So if you've been on TikTok or Reels or YouTube Shorts or any social media platform in the last couple years, you've probably seen a lot of weird animals pop up on there and people asking what they are. And you've probably also noticed that a lot of these people will be holding the animal in these videos and photos, which, don't hold wild animals, please. Do not try to interact with wild animals, please.
In the case of cephalopods, there's a few species that are outrageously toxic that have gone viral on TikTok because of scientists and zoologists saying, hey, maybe let's not pick up a wild animal because this one, especially in this case, is toxic, which is a pretty reasonable request. But many species of cephalopods contain highly, highly potent toxins that are produced in their salivary glands. And these toxins are used to immobilize and digest prey. However, they can secrete them anytime they're spooked or in distress. So, again, handling wild animals can make them stressed. So, don't. It's never a good idea. You will just upset them. Just like how I'm sure you would not want someone poking you or destroying your habitat. Do not pick these animals up and do not mess with their homes. Just don't. It's not worth it. The reason why some cephalopods use toxins to immobilize their prey, though, is because their esophagus is very small and runs through their brain. So their food has to be pulverized in order for it to fit through a really slim space. And the very famous example of toxic cephalopods is the blue-ringed octopus, which is a species of octopus that can literally fit in the palm of your hand. It's teeny and adorable, but very, very toxic. And the toxin that this species in particular releases is tetrodotoxin, which is also called TTX. Besides being a drug that is frequently used in neuroscience research and drug development research, for anyone who doesn't know, TTX is a sodium channel blocker, and it can block sodium channels on the membrane of nerve cells, which is obviously very important because all ion channels are very important in sending action potentials. But TTX can also quickly induce muscle paralysis, including in the muscles of the respiratory tract. So it can very quickly make it so that you cannot breathe. Obviously, that's a problem. And although the blue-ring octopus is very small, it does pack enough TTX to immobilize multiple humans. So please don't touch them. The moral of the story is, though, just don't pick up animals or touch them if you don't know what they are, because they could be outrageously toxic or harmful to you.
The undeniable intelligence that the octopus also possesses has sparked a debate as to whether or not octopuses have a consciousness. Essentially, what's being debated is whether or not the octopus has several conscious fields that may or may not be unified.
The difference in these two theories is that a unified consciousness is kind of similar to that of a human's. So obviously our thought process on this is quite biased because what it means to have to be conscious is shaped by our own opinion and our perception of consciousness. So that obviously could be different in different species, but the current belief is that they do have a unified consciousness, but it's not up to our quote-unquote standard of what a unified consciousness looks like for us, which I think is kind of cool. If you are looking to learn more about this subject of whether or not the octopus has a consciousness or what it means to have a consciousness, I recommend checking out the book Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. I had this book on my reading list for forever, like my personal reading list, not like a school reading list, obviously. But I had this book on my list for a very long time, and I finally was going through my reading list after exams because I had some time where I wanted to get back into reading a little bit, and I realized that this book was quite short, so I picked up a copy and just kind of sped read through it. And this is another reason why I wanted to write this episode, is also because I recently read this book, because I had a lot of information from this book like kind of fresh in my head. And it's a pretty interesting look at consciousness and the octopus's brain and behavior. One of my favorite things about the octopus is just how incredibly smart and almost creative these animals are. They are so skilled at quickly adapting to their environment and to any obstacles that they face. Another interesting story that showcases just how smart octopuses are also comes from Other Minds, and it's how octopuses can actually recognize people, which is honestly scary. I discussed earlier how the octopus's eye is kind of similar to ours and is extremely complex, but the fact that they can see and remember what individuals look like, even if they don't necessarily know to the same level that we do, that like we're a different species, they're still able to recognize something about people. I can't remember, is it an aquarium or it was a rescue center. It was somewhere in Australia where they had an octopus and they were feeding him shrimp. And shrimp is kind of the octopus version of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Yeah, it has substance, like it's technically food, but it's not what you usually want to eat for dinner. And in this case, the octopus held onto the food, waited until the aquarist or zoologist came back after feeding other animals, and tossed the shrimp out of its enclosure. And that obviously takes a very high level of intelligence to be able to register and understand those kinds of behaviors. Usually, when we think of high intelligence, we tend to correlate this trait with other very social animals. Communication in the animal kingdom comes in all shapes and sizes. It can be anything from sound to chemical communication to visual communication. And while the octopus is usually a solitary animal, they can still communicate. And the octopus just so happens to have a very keen sense of smell. I know we usually don't associate marine animals with having a keen sense of smell, but most marine vertebrates do actually have a very good sense of smell. Although chemoreception in some marine mammals can be a little bit different from what we usually think of as smell. And not all chemoreception is technically smell. In fact, our sense of taste and sometimes touch can also be forms of chemoreception. Put a little asterisk next to touch because technically that's a lot more complicated, but I'm not getting into that right now. A strong sense of smell is conserved through most vertebrate populations, but it's still being researched in invertebrates and mollusks. The current hypothesized way that octopuses are able to communicate with one another is through pheromones. And as I said before, this would be through their sense of smell or chemoreception. I would like to dive more into this topic, but there just isn't enough research for me to feel comfortable talking about it here because unfortunately, a lot of what we believe is mostly speculation, which obviously happens a lot in science, but it just is not enough research for me to want to talk about this topic right now. But pheromones are a whole Pandora's box of an episode in themselves. All in all, whether it be their adaptability, their intelligence, or their interesting personalities, the octopus will never fail to fall out of my top 3 favorite animals.
And I've probably rambled on for a bit too long on this topic, but thank you so much for tuning to this episode of On My Nerves, and I hope you all enjoyed it. As always, I'll link any studies or articles I may have discussed in this episode in the show notes, which is located in the podcast description. Here you can also find any videos that may have inspired parts of this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to leave a review on Spotify and check out the podcast Instagram, @OnMyNervesPod. If you have any questions about this episode or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me there. Check back next week for another episode of On My Nerves.